Hi, my name is Jim Cooper. I'm the Senior Petrochemical Advisor with the American Fuel and Petrochemical Manufacturers. I'm here to talk about why the petrochemical industry is considered critical infrastructure. We make 6 chemicals: ethylene, propylene, butylene, benzene, toluene, and xylene. These 6 materials are the building blocks for all the modern materials that are found in a hospital setting. From the masks that the surgeons are wearing, to the protective gloves, the gowns, the booties, even the draperies, IV bags, the tubing, single-use syringes, all these start with those 6 chemicals. We have to operate 24/7, 365 days a year to enable these materials to go through these supply chains. That's why we're considered critical infrastructure.
We've heard it before. The call is serve. At the turn of the century, Americans were essentially limited to traveling by horse. We answered, producing the gasoline that fueled America's rise to an economic powerhouse. In the 1930s, the Great Depression had the economy reeling. We answered, creating jobs and everyday products that made lives better. In the 1940s, the Axis powers threatened to destroy the free world. We answered, producing the fuel that enabled the Allies' airstrikes. In the 1970s, an energy crisis ground America to a halt. We answered, becoming the most efficient crude refining system in the world. In 2020, the coronavirus came to our shores. We answered, working around the clock to produce the raw materials for the masks, gloves, and sanitizers needed to protect us all. When the next call comes, we'll be right there with you, ready to answer.
Oh, it's beautiful today. I absolutely love to fly. It's my favorite thing to do.
Schneider 76 Whiskey Bravo's airborne.
My name is Michael. I'm the founder of Pilots to the Rescue. The first rescue that I did was back in 2015. Someone took these puppies and threw them on the side of the ditch.
1000 climbing, IDET 976 Whiskey Bravo.
After I rescued those puppies, I realized that there's such a need for rescuing animals.
Today we're going to be rescuing 16 animals, 12 puppies, 4 dogs. North Carolina has a big overcrowded shelter.
They're getting 50 dogs a day, and if you don't get them out, they unfortunately have to euthanize them.
3025 976 Whiskey Bravo.
We can rescue animals in a short period of time.
Yes, Mama, I know. I take care of you. I take care of you.
I'm grateful for the work that the people do in the refining industry. The essential resource that we need is fuel, and I needed to do this mission.
Raise your hand if you never want to do this again. We all want our lives back, but we also want to be safer and smarter tomorrow. America's fuel and petrochemical manufacturers know how to weather storms. We proudly keep essential services running, and we're making the key ingredients for new products, like reusable PPE, advanced testing, and cleaning solutions that help bring us all safely back together. This is how we make progress.
Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Bolen. I am the Global Manager of Loss Prevention and Emergency Response for LyondellBasell Corporation. I work in their corporate HS&E organization in downtown Houston. Today I'm here to talk about some project learnings regarding above ground storage tank fire preparedness. I'd like to thank AFPM for allowing me to share these learnings from some of the work that we've done here at LyondellBasell. Let me start off by introducing myself. I was born and raised in Pennsylvania, but have moved around the country quite a bit following career opportunities. I have a degree in industrial safety sciences from Indiana University of Pennsylvania. My biggest takeaway from there was my wife, Missy, who's been my biggest source of encouragement over the years. I do have about 31 years of experience in chemical manufacturing. About 20 of that was in pulp and paper manufacturing, about 5 of that in ethanol manufacturing and food and industrial products, and then about 6 years in petrochemical. In most of that time, I served as an HSE generalist in all areas of HSE, but over the last 3.5 years, been focused very heavily in loss prevention and emergency preparedness. My prior experience included all of that, but anyhow, that kind of summarizes my background. So a couple of things I just want to point out. I just need to mention this disclaimer that I am offering in this presentation content today that might serve as experience for you as you might tackle a similar type of assessment regarding fire preparedness for above ground storage tanks, but I am not intending to give you definitive directions that you should follow. That said, let's dig into the content. So our assessment a couple of years back, because of a large number of industrial loss events that occurred in the Houston region especially, but also across the country. Many of you are well aware that we have had a period of time over the last few years where there have been large, very well publicized events that have resulted in a lot of scrutiny brought to the industry regarding fire and fire response and industrial impacts to the communities in which we exist. We've seen some of that impacting our organization through mutual aid agreements that we have. One instance was in Southeast Germany, and then also here in the Houston region, a couple of those. When these events have occurred, we have been called as part of the mutual aid organization to help mitigate and control those events. That has offered us at LyondellBasell some insight of direct experience that we could try to take away learnings from, to go back to our own sites and make sure that we are as equally prepared or better prepared and learn from other people's experience. Unfortunately, as unfortunate as it may be, we want to capture those learnings as much as we can. So as part of Channel Industry Mutual Aid here in the Houston region, several of our facilities have responded to some of the larger events over the last few years. And we've conducted critiques with the teams that have come back to say, what could we make sure that we need to have in place? What could we do better in our own facilities? And we've also, whether it's good or bad, have tried to pull learnings from the Court of Public Scrutiny, right? There's been plenty of press coverage, plenty of regulatory response to some of these things. An example of that would be in the Houston region. The Harris County Fire Marshal's Office has been very responsive and following up and taking actions to try to make sure that there are measures of preparedness in place well before events like this might reoccur in the region. And at the state level, there's actually been a state bill passed in regard to above ground storage tanks and the design of those from a process safety and fire readiness perspective. I was able to participate in some of that work with some of you that probably here in attendance, and appreciate that opportunity. But these are really focused on, as well as our underwriter insurers. Many of them have, in our ongoing third-party assessments of risk insurance, they've brought more attention to larger event scenarios, the worst case scenarios, if you will, and what the fire water systems, emergency pre-plans that we have in place at our facilities across the Americas and actually globally that these events have brought attention to. So a lot of attention there. Lyondell, like most of the companies represented in the attendees here, has a very well-established, strong emphasis on process safety. We do have a number of initiatives in place in regard to some of these facilities that I'm preparing to talk about. We have an EIV directive. We have a sustaining capital program for fire water. We have a firefighting foam directive that is guiding and directing a response to changes in the firefighting foam formulations. There's an excellent presentation following this from Mitch Hubert that I will refer to a couple of times that I think will bring additional light to what we're here to talk about today. And really what this assessment was done for was to make sure that we didn't have blind spots. You know, we spent a lot of resources, we spent a lot of time on a number of things, but we all fall victim to potential blind spots. One of the things you'll notice on this slide is we say the power of many. So when we pulled the group together, to assemble this, we tried to make sure that we had emergency response leaders built into the design of the process. And we did that primarily because these are the individuals that are responsible for putting these fires out and responding and making sure that we're prepared in advance. So our assessment charter is here. I mentioned it briefly. There's just 3 takeaways that I would offer as we set out to do our own internal assessment of where our exposures might be for a large-scale fire in a tank farm, above ground storage tank area. There are 3 things. One is make sure you have clear alignment with company leadership and understanding of your deliverables, because it's important that we actually respond to what they're asking for. We don't wander off and we don't fail to answer the questions that they've put before us, right? The other thing is to make sure that you don't commit to actions without knowing what you don't know. That was one of our biggest concerns, is we were going to set out and do an assessment, but we're not sure what we're going to find. So we didn't want to be overly anxious to commit to some of the things without getting some more data. And then the third thing is select the standards to which you're going to compare your performance. So in our case, we chose API, NFPA, and we also had some internal standards of design and operation. And then we also selected one of our facilities that I would say were a leading performer that had a specialized procedure around these assets, tank farm areas, and how they managed those assets that we wanted to compare to. And the API standard was 2510, NFPA was 11 and 30. Those are the standards we primarily focused on, although there were a few others. So just to give you an appreciation for maybe the scope of our assessment, we are a global company, and we included 3 continents in the areas we operate that we were assessing assets in, and these offered very different regulatory environments. They also offered some different cultural biases and some regional methodologies. Some areas approach fires from the end of the pipe, and some of them approached it from the beginning of the pumps, right? So just some different strategies. The other thing we did is when we designed this assessment process, we really wanted to design it with ease of use in mind. Keep it simple, the KISS principle, and we wanted to do it a one and done. We didn't want to have to do a lot of follow-up as we place demands on facilities to complete these assessments. We wanted to be able to go out and capture the risk or the identified opportunities with a tank farm, and then bring that data back for further analysis, maybe by the core group or even to site level, but you don't have to go back out and reconduct any type of formal survey. We also wanted to make sure it could be conducted by a non-technical person. And one of the things we realized early on was we wanted our emergency response leaders, not our process safety personnel and staff, to conduct these assessments, because if a fire were to occur, the emergency response leaders were going to be the ones that needed to drive those responses. They did not have they had a very different technical background and very broad range of experiences. That we wanted to set up something that had minimal training required. We tried to do that through the tool itself, and I think you'll see that in a moment. And we wanted to be able to be administered in the field. It wasn't something that needed to be done on a computer or anything like that. And we did need to identify in advance some of the information that was needed before we went to the field. So a couple of developmental steps. First of all, that power of many. Also, we tried to pull together the subject matter experts to develop the assessment. A couple of things we learned, or I'd like to share from that effort, is one, the functions that we included were process safety, loss prevention, and environmental. They were the ones we felt were most pertinent to the process, to understand the risks, the equipment, the control measures, and in the ways that some of those things contradicted or challenged one another because they have some different interests and different priorities. The other thing, from an experience perspective, we tried to get firefighting experience, process safety experience. We needed some folks that had qualitative assessment skills and experience conducting broad assessments in the organization. So we sought that out. And also loss prevention design. So some of the countermeasures and controls that many of you manage, we tried to make sure we had that represented in our core team. So a couple of things we went through. We tried hard. First of all, we normalized around a bunch of data. We tried not to chase rabbits. We did some of that. We had to get back away from that and focus on the core charter of what we were asked to do, which was a quick, thorough assessment of our internal tank farm and tank bunds to understand where that risk was. But that normalization did bring us to a very clear consensus of the team. We also tried to avoid complexity. We decided early on not to weight our considerations any heavier than any others. We wanted to make sure that we could quickly assess things. So we didn't get into the minute details. Outliers should not drive the process. So we needed quick, simple assessment. Data collection needed to be something that could be done by our emergency response leaders in the field, and once again, a pretty concise, timely manner. And the level of depth, also organizational bias. Now, one example of that we identified fairly early on was most of our dikes and containment bunds were designed for environmental purposes. They were not designed for fire strategy. And maybe it's because of the regulatory focus on that, or the resulting design or definition of our design standards internally to satisfy those regulations. Regardless, there was a bias toward environmental control on the loss of containment and the containment process. And we kind of stepped back and said, listen, we need to ignore that and look at the fire ramifications of loss of containment. A couple other things on the assessment tool. We needed to make sure it satisfied the charter. It was focused very, very significantly on that. And we looked at quantitative versus qualitative. Quantitative provides a prioritization ease. The more quantified it is, it self-filters, right? You can look at your priorities very easily. You have numerical process probably built in that will very quickly rise the priorities to the surface. Qualitative is a little bit easier to assess, maybe, a little less mathematical. So we tried to balance those two, and the end in mind was one of our focus. We wanted to collect our data in a manner that was very self-evident to those that were conducting the assessments, that there would be immediate learnings. And one of the things that was one of our greatest takeaways were the emergency response leaders that conducted the heart of these assessments walked away with immediately with a better understanding of things that they should focus on, go-dos, and action items that they were fairly motivated to get after because they were the ones responsible. And it brought to light either blind spots, oversights, opportunities where they may have gotten some put some blinders on in areas of focus and missed some other things. And those were issues that they were immediately able to walk away from. And then also, once again, the assessment tool needed to be fit for use. And I mentioned it earlier, our emergency response leaders were the deliverers of this process, and this really needed to be something they were comfortable with. So from an assessment scope perspective, just to give you an idea of what we focused on OBL areas versus IBL areas. So we were looking at the outside battery limit, tank farms and bunds, not tank groupings that were inside process areas. And we just made an arbitrary decision to focus on those first, and then anything we learned from that would carry over into the process side. And our process hazard analysis, of course, evaluates all of these areas fairly thoroughly, but we wanted to really go look at the primary tank groupings we had, which were usually outside the battery limits. So we looked at tank groupings as opposed to individual containers. There may have been some exceptions to that, but generally speaking, it were groupings, and our full focus was on fire. The fire focus of flammables and combustible storage. Things we looked at there, really, the assets, although there are some very limiting capital intensive changes if we were to move tanks or relocate storage, we needed to understand the limitations of our existing practices. Many of our assets for storage were built years ago, not according to today's industrial standards or today's general practices by many of the groups here in attendance. But we needed, once again, to understand what challenges those old designs or past practices may pose so that we could compensate for those with other considerations. So some of those things we looked at also is fire suppression readiness is one of the big areas of concern under procedural aspects. One of those things was changing water demands, right? We have just a simple thing is when most of these facilities were designed, we were probably using industrial fire pumpers at 1500 GPM pumping capacity. Today we use 3,000 GPM and higher. These larger pumpers have doubled the demand for water. That's put more challenges. It's on not only the supplies, but it's also put more challenges on the containment, right? Another area that, once again, that Mitch is going to talk about next is foam formulations. Firefighting foam has changed radically, is still changing fairly radically in the last couple of years, and will continue as we make transitions to different formulas as certain products are no longer available. Many of those use a higher water volume, and that requires more containment, more impoundment, and more waste control in a fire event. So that was, to us, one of the most critical takeaways, that we needed to really evaluate that when we looked at our diking design and things like that, right? So let me get to the tool, and this is a little bit of an eye test. I apologize for that. The assessment tool itself, we tried to come up with something. So let me just describe the screen here. You have 10 columns. These were the 10 considerations that we landed on ultimately. There were some iterations finally to get us to this. That normalizing was not too painful. It was a little bit fun, a little frustrating, but we landed here. Spacing, and we used the CCPS tool for that, which is today one of our driving design standards, if you would. Tactical access, diking, foam systems, foam deployment readiness, cooling and heat protection provisions, pre-planned definition, water supply, impoundment, EIVs, and product isolation. Those were the areas of concern that we were evaluating, or controls that we were evaluating. The green line at the top with a 1 credit on the numerical scale is kind of best in class. That's what we would aspire to have that in place as much as possible. And 5 at the bottom would be where we would see the greatest opportunity, or the greatest risk, if you will. So the circle here, the little red circle, is just an example of essentially what we did when we went to the field. Was we took a highlighter or a marker, and we just highlighted the lines descriptively that describe what we were looking at. So we asked the emergency response leaders to take this document, print as many as you need to, go to the field, and one and done, you fill one of these out for each tank grouping. And we worked with the plants on tank groupings to try to determine what a working fire scenario would be. Generally speaking, it was one common diked area, which may include three tanks or containers. It may include up to 15, depending upon the design of that tank farm when it was constructed, considering changes to design over the years. So try to keep it simple, 1 being best performance, 5 being greatest opportunity, 3 being in the middle, and 2 and 4 just to kind of give you something in the middle to select. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about an example here in just a moment. So a couple of things. Once again, we tried to design this to be used in the field, and the emergency response coordinators were intended to be the people that were doing the assessments, and clearly that was one of the biggest takeaways. They self-identified the blind spots that they may have built into pre-plans or oversights. Elevated their motivation to go back and address those issues. Also a desire to be involved in other activities such as PHAs and also reliability regarding like foam systems and the need and importance of inspections for those foam systems. Also reinforce the importance of drills. And I'll touch base on that a little bit, but drills are the only area where we really demonstrate readiness and we test our readiness. We can pre-plan, we can install equipment, we can put in countermeasures, but until we conduct drills, we don't really know, right? So that was one of the big takeaways that they walked away with. And also this exercise brought a very high importance to the changing strategies being driven by firefighting foam formulations in water volumes, in surface area for firefighting, and the demands that places upon those foam decisions and staging and things like that. So more to come on that. But let's see here. So, and one of the things we did try to manage through the tool is the narrative descriptions on the tool. I should also say, those of you that are ACC members, the American Chemistry Council, this document is out in one of their excellence models for ACC members to utilize. So this is an example of one of these areas. One of the columns has to do with tactical access. So this is really evaluating from best case to worst case of the ability to actually approach a fire with a tactical mobile team. So just as an example, one would be a four-sided access. You could get to it. It would be like the tank farm sitting out in the middle of a field, and you can get to it from whichever wind direction, whichever direction would be most beneficial to fight the fire. There wouldn't be any adjacent sensitive receptors, maybe a water source that could be contaminated with runoff or hydrocarbons that may leak out of the diked area. And there wouldn't be any unrestricted foam that could reach the tank. So some things, if you have to reach too far to reach it, you can't effectively establish a foam blanket, right? The foam is dispersed unevenly, or you have a lot of slop or wind impact. So, and you look down at 5, as you go down the list, 3-sided, 2-sided, 1-sided, and then maybe no open sides because the tank farm is surrounded by process equipment, which would be a worst case scenario where you'd have to kind of get in there somehow with a tactical team to apply a foam blanket or to address a fire if one were to occur. So this would just give you an idea of the breakdown. There's another example here in pre-plan definition. This one was really focused on drills. You can have a really good drill, or you can really have a really good pre-plan, but if you don't drill it, do you know it's a good one? Do you know what gaps there might be? But the example would be you have a thorough, specific pre-plan just designed for this tank farm, or you have maybe one intended for this tank farm, but it may have some holes in it, might be incomplete. The other thing would have a similar event. So in other words, a pre-plan for our tank farms that we would apply across all the tank farms, despite there being some differences in each tank farm, like where's the manifold locations at, that type of thing. And then the last would be a generic pre-plan that would be applied across the plant, last being no relevant pre-plans, and we just figure it out. When we get there, we do our size up, and then we deploy our responders as we normally would at a fire, but that will take longer if it's done safely, correct? So anyhow, those are examples I wanted to share. So a couple of preparation steps that we went through as we did this was, we ran a proof of concept. So once we put this together, we went to a moderately sized facility with a couple of tank farms, and we did this with the emergency response coordinator. So we tried to evaluate their ease of execution. And where they had questions, we made notes. We came back and we refined the questions. We refined the terminology to try to make it more user-friendly for someone in that role. We also captured any oversights into descriptors. Little things, but some things make a big difference. We captured those. We also added one of the columns as a result of that first proof of concept. There was something, actually we did that after the workshop, I'm going to talk about it here in a minute. But we did end up adding a column to satisfy our emergency response customer base that was actually expected to administer this. We also realized an opportunity to have some data collection in advance, and we put a table on the back side of the document that could be collected ahead of time for them to reference when they're in the field. Essentially to collect some of that data from the process safety experts and peers that they work with that they may not be as familiar with, but the process safety team members could pull very readily. We did an implementation workshop that was 4 hours long with the emergency response coordinators from our U.S. sites. We went to one of the sites. We talked to them about the tool. We walked them through the tool, gave them examples, and set them up in small teams to go in the field and evaluate the same tank farm. Everyone did the same tank farm in small groupings. When they were finished, that created some synergy, some encouragement. Somebody that was struggling was maybe with somebody that was a little more comfortable with the process, and some accountability to move forward and understand and absorb the information. That's where we learned we needed to add one of the columns because they were that interested in that issue that came up in the field, which was excellent. We established some spreadsheets for developing and refining the data and analyzing it when it came in because there was an awful lot of data that came in. We assessed over 200 tank farms I want to say it was over 25 facilities. So give or take 20 to 25 facilities. And another thing that we felt was proved to be very critical is we assigned coaches from our loss prevention and emergency response leadership group to all the plants. So those that were going out in the field to do this had a coach they could lean on for questions, for affirmation, concerns, and then we also deployed some assistance from the corporate team to support the plants that had the largest volume of tank farms they needed to assess. And that also was very helpful. Some of the learnings that we walked away with, we have many ongoing initiatives. I mentioned some of those earlier. Our fire water program, EIV, levy assessments, many of those things. We're refining what we already have in place. This reinforced the importance of those things. The other thing it really talked about was firefighting foam considerations. And I can't emphasize that enough. I'm sure many of the organizations represented in attendance are wrestling with this issue. Mitch is going to talk a lot more about that. But this is going to impact how we are prepared for different fires. I think it's causing us to revisit our diking especially, and also fixed systems versus semi-fixed versus mobile and pre-staged foam, because of the timeliness of delivery and the importance of delivering it where we need it, and the effectiveness of the foam, which differs based upon formulas and based upon choice. One of the other things we identified was mobile response times. One example is one of our sites really has no industrial mutual aid. And it's a fairly large site, so they only have municipal support with limited industrial readiness for firefighting. So they really need to be prepared for their tank farm if they have a fire there, because they have to capture that fire. It's going to be much more unlikely that the municipal departments supporting that plant are going to be well equipped to make that same level of difference. So we're looking very hard at their apparatus to make sure they're well prepared and that they have what they need, as opposed to the other plants that could call in a different apparatus because of local mutual aid through the industrial, such as with channel industry mutual aid. The complexity of the fire or pre-plans that we identified when we went through this has a lot to do with the frequency of drills. If the fires are going to grow rapidly, potentially, then those pre-plans really need to be refined and drills need to occur so that we can make deployment very quickly. That was one of the things that we walked away with and said, we also need to pre-stage some equipment, because the more we have in place, the faster we can get that up and running, our fire suppression efforts. We also looked hard at sensitive receptors and identified places where we need some specialized pre-plans. So a couple of some specific takeaways I'd like to offer here. I'm not going to go through this whole list, but the ones that really stood out is the emergency response leaders were so much more familiar with their challenges after they had completed this effort. And that was across the globe. Whether it was in Germany, where the facilities over there have professional firefighters in most of our sites, or in the U.S., where we have operators that are trained as industrial firefighters in most of our plants, and they had firsthand knowledge to go back to their officers with, to challenge their shift response teams and say, listen, we need to talk about these things, because these are very real areas of where we need to focus our improvements. So that was one. The other one is once again, our expanded firewater capital program. We have a process in place where we're evaluating our firewater systems right now and making sure that we have what we need in place. But one of the things we've added to that is the need to look at the diking design, because the size of the dikes that primarily were designed for environmental purposes have a whole lot to do with the size of the fire. So we may need to improve or just alter the design of our dikes to minimize the fire potential, and also to change the type of fire we may have to fight. And we've reconsidered the need to do that as part of the solution strategies we have on the table. But that was a very high takeaway from this that will be a critical step we take going forward, most likely, in some of our sites. And then the last one I've mentioned several times is firefighting foam strategies are changing because of the formulations. And Mitch is going to talk more about that. So we did realize that there were clearly some interdependent considerations, and this slide looks a lot like one I already spoke to. But the situation really is if you address one of these considerations around how the fire's behaviors, the sources, the things that cause them to escalate or make suppression difficult, there's additions and takeaways in this, and they all cost money. Right, so we're trying to find the most effective way to go about that and affect that fire window. One of those things that we're talking about, I mentioned earlier, is fixed versus mobilized foam delivery systems and strategies to do that. One of the things we've realized is we're going to need an awful lot more foam. And when we do that, are we going to do that with portable tenders? And how do we share those? Or how much of that do we need to purchase, and where do we have it? Or where can we put fixed systems, and how do they differ from the ones we already have in place? So just many of the things that we realized in this list. Some of these were surprises. Most of them we had a pretty good understanding of, but they really reinforced, once again, a lot of the initiatives we already had in place. So a few action steps I would offer as takeaways. Make sure that as you tackle something like this in your organization, that you identify and consider the implications of internal and external standards that you're going to evaluate yourself against, because some of those have conflict built into them. One standard, for instance, environmental, doesn't have a lot of consideration for fire, but as you develop fire diking strategies, they have implications for environmental impoundment, those kind of things. But consider those pending changes that are impacting those standards and any internal initiatives that you have as well. Make sure you try to decide and come to a quick consensus on the level of detail and the strategy of your assessment, so that you get out of it the most you can, because there was quite a bit of exercise that went into this. It took us several months to do this across the company, and then also to do the analysis and determine what our priorities were and how we went forward, and the communication strategies as a result of that. The other thing we did is, if you look back at that assessment tool, we tried to identify minimum areas of what we would hope for in each of those 10 columns. And it differed a little bit if it involved, for instance, toxins versus just flammables. So we went through and we tried to determine, they weren't absolutes, but they were target areas. It helped us identify where we were below that target, when we're above it. Also, make sure you include stakeholders, especially in solutions. So when we've completed our assessments, we made presentations to each of the sites involved, to their leadership teams, their loss prevention teams, and HSE groups, to help them understand how these should fold into plant priorities and plant budgets and things like that. The other thing is, the stakeholders should own and drive those improvement plans. Hierarchy of controls, obviously, integrate into operating and response processes that they have in their plants. And then, because many of these impact different functions and different functional goals at the site level, so they need to build those into their systems. It wasn't our place at the corporate level to script that, if you will. We wanted to help them understand those challenges and work with them to try to bring that to a better place. And then the last thing I would leave you with is that true readiness can only be evaluated through drills. So from an emergency response loss prevention perspective, I can't encourage your organizations enough to do drills, whether they're tabletop or tactical. Tactical is usually better. Tabletop can also bring a lot of learning. But please make sure that you're doing those drills to determine, are you ready, or do you think you're ready? And with that, I will turn this over to Mitch Hubert with Perimeter Solutions, and Mitch has a whole lot more to talk about regarding firefighting.
Well, thank you for having me. As you know, my name is Mitch Hubert, and I'm with Perimeter Solutions. I'm a formulation chemist and have been in the firefighting foam industry for more than 40 years. So I guess at this point, we'll just get started. The title of my presentation is A New Era in Firefighting Foam, The Times They Are A-Changin'. So really, why are we here? Well, there are environmental pressures that continue to mount against fluorinated foams worldwide. And unfortunately, in many cases, the legislation already enacted or proposed to be enacted outpaces the available technology. In the United States, this legislation is really occurring right now on a state-by-state basis. So some states don't regulate the use of fluorinated firefighting foams at all, and other states legislate them very aggressively. So it kind of depends on where you folks are as to what type of legislation might be enacted and the timing of that legislation as to when those new rules would be enacted. Well, how did foam get to be an environmental issue in the first place? In essence, it's always been an issue, as Mother Nature needs to deal with anything discharged or spilled into the environment. Things like toxicity, biodegradability, BOD loading, sewage treatment plant treatability have always been a concern. But recently, the new concerns have arisen over fluorochemicals in the environment, and this has become a topic of discussion around the world. And there are both health concerns and concerns that they do not biodegrade in the environment. But the rules are kind of changing. In the old rules, it was sort of a 3 strikes and you're out type of deal that the US EPA enacted. First of all, they would look at whether or not a particular chemical was persistent in the environment. And if it's persistent, then they wanted to take a look at whether or not it would bioaccumulate, or in other words, the level or concentration of that particular chemical would increase over time and increase as we went higher and higher and higher into the food chain. And if it was bioaccumulative, then the other thing that they were interested in is it toxic, and at what level does it become toxic? The new rule has kept the persistence, bioaccumulation, and toxicity values, but they're also taking a look now at whether or not things are mobile in the environment. If they're released, is it easy for them to get into a waterway and then pretty much move throughout the world as things change and move through the water column? The focus has changed in the United States and throughout the world from 2 very specific chemicals, PFOS and PFOA, to a broad range of chemicals called PFAS. And many of you have probably heard that term, PFAS. It stands for perfluorinated alkyl substance or polyfluorinated alkyl substance. The US EPA only regulates PFOS and PFOA, and they're 2 acid salts. However, groups of people worldwide have managed to change that focus to the new acronym PFAS, to the point you would think that anything that has a carbon-fluorine bond is extremely dangerous. That's really not the case, but at this point, the train has left the station, and it's really not worthwhile discussing whether or not it is or isn't an issue. So why the concern that we have? Well, in 2016, the US EPA established a lifetime health advisory for those 2 chemicals that I was talking about earlier, PFOS and PFOA. And they set limits for those 2 chemicals at 70 parts per trillion. And if both of them were present, then they would just add the concentration that they found, and the combined maximum limit would be 70 parts per trillion. And this is for drinking water, and it's an advisory. That advisory, and I'll quote from the publication from the EPA, is designed to provide Americans, including the most sensitive populations, with a margin of protection from a lifetime of exposure to PFOS and PFOA from the drinking water that they have. Well, this is advisory only, and it's not legally binding unless it's adopted by law by various states or other jurisdictions. And that's in essence what's happening, as I said earlier, as we're going kind of state by state and determining what levels of PFAS are available before you start getting into trouble. I'd like to digress just a little bit and give you a real brief history of the types of foams, because foams have really followed the petrochemical industry. The reason that we're using foams is that some of the petrochemical fires can be very, very large in nature, as you are all aware. And foam is about the only extinguishing agent that you can use when you start getting into these really large catastrophic type conflagrations. So the first of the foams that came into the marketplace was called a chemical foam, and it was available from 1950 to the early 1940s, maybe even into the middle 1940s. And it was really a 2-part foam that was an acid-base reaction. In that reaction, you had a chemical that could liberate carbon dioxide. And I always use the classic grade school demonstration of pouring vinegar and baking soda together. And of course, you get this froth that's developed. And that was, in essence, kind of the basis behind how a chemical foam worked. In the early 1930s, protein foam was introduced to the marketplace, and it's still available today. In the 1950s, when detergents first started coming into existence, synthetic high and medium expansion foams were brought into the marketplace, and they're still available today. In around 1963, AFFF, aqueous film forming foam, was developed through the cooperation of the Naval Research Labs and the 3M Corporation, and it's still available today. Fluoroprotein foam followed quickly on its heels. It was introduced around 1965 by National Foam. Then there were alcohol-resistant versions of both AFFF and fluoroprotein foam, that were first coming into the marketplace in around 1980, and they're still available today. Class A foam was developed around 1984, specifically for use on Class A type materials, and it's still available today. SFFF, which is the new name that is being adopted for fluorine-free foam, was developed around 2003, and it, of course, is still available today. And then alcohol-resistant versions of SFFF, which stands for synthetic fluorine-free foam, was developed first around 2014, and it's still available today. Well, fluorinated foams are what we're here to talk about, I guess, and how we switch from one to the other. And fluorosurfactants are the key ingredient in AFFFs or in fluoroprotein foams or in film-forming fluoroprotein foams. And they bring two very important characteristics to the party. First of all, they provide low surface tension that allows for the formation of a film on hydrocarbon fuels. Now, typically what happens if you try to float a watery film or a watery substance on top of a hydrocarbon fuel, it of course sinks to the bottom because of the density differential. However, if you can lower the surface tension really, really low, around the 17, 18 dynes per centimeter, you can actually fool Mother Nature a little bit and get a very thin film of that watery solution that's draining from foam bubbles to stay on top of the surface of the fuel. And so that's how AFFF actually got its name, aqueous film forming foam. Probably more important though, and what's the topic of discussion as we try to transition into these fluorine-free foams, is that the fluorochemicals, the fluorosurfactants and fluoropolymers that we use in AFFFs tend to bring a characteristic to the fuel that we call oleophobicity, which simply means that it's oil hating or oil fearing. And it's so a foam bubble is able to shed any fuel that might come in contact with it. If I were to take a single bubble of a dishwashing detergent and put it on a Petri dish, that bubble wall would very quickly start to wick the hydrocarbon fuel that it's sitting on. If it's on a hydrocarbon fuel in that Petri dish, it would start wicking it up almost like the wick of a kerosene lamp. If I were to take that same individual bubble and put it on a Petri dish that has a hydrocarbon fuel, it would not tend to wick up the fuel. And so that fuel shedding characteristics is very, very, very important in firefighting foams. Well, all AFFFs contain PFAS, both historically and those that are being sold today. If you have stocks of existing AFFF or alcohol-resistant AFFF, or are buying new AFFF or alcohol-resistant AFFF, it certainly contains PFAS components. And AFFFs and AFFFs can be broken down on their PFAS chemistry into three really broad categories. The first one would be a legacy PFOS containing AFFF. The second one would be a legacy fluorotelmer AFFF that contains C8 and longer chain lengths, and many of you have heard the terms C6 chemistry and C8 chemistry, and that's really what we're talking about here when we talk about the fluorotelmers. And the third class would be the short chain or C6 fluorochemicals that would be used in the firefighting foam. We'll take a little bit of a look at each one of them. If we take a look at the PFOS type legacy foam concentrates, those sales ended around 2002, and they contain and break down in the environment into both PFOS and PFOA. The Firefighting Foam Coalition recommends these foams to be removed from service as soon as possible, and the FFFC also recommends that AFFF concentrates be disposed of at facilities that can handle hazardous waste. Now, most jurisdictions right now, these fluorosurfactants that are found in AFFFs or AFFFs are not classified as hazardous waste, but it won't be long until we could see that happening in the future. All of these foams that we're talking about in terms of PFOS type chemistry were sold under the brand name of 3M Light Water. Many of you will remember that in 2000, 3M made an announcement that they were going to exit the firefighting foam marketplace along with all of the other products that contain PFOS. And in 2002, they actually stopped production of the light water brand AFFFs. We can also then take a look at what we call the legacy fluorotelmer type AFFFs, and really the only difference is how the 3M company or other fluorosurfactant manufacturers get to the fluorosurfactants that we're utilizing. There's two basic ways. They could do it by electrofluorination, which is what the 3M company used and what produced the PFOS, or they can use what's called a telomerization process, and that's what the rest of the world pretty much was using. So the legacy fluorotelmer C8 type products encompasses all the brands other than 3M light water. There were a few European brands that were licensed by 3M to use their fluorosurfactants, so some of those did contain PFOS. The fluorotelmer type C8 and higher homolog products do not contain or break down into PFOS. Those long chain fluorosurfactants do, however, have the potential to break down into PFOA. Remember, PFOS and PFOA were the two chemicals that were regulated by the EPA in their drinking water advisory. Firefighting Foam Coalition recommends that users consider replacing these foams with the modern short chain C6 type foams, or go to the SFFF type foams, the fluorine free that can be used on Class B foams. And the fluorotelmer foams have been sold from the 1970s, the long chain, until around 2016. And by 2016, most of the fluorotelmer fluorosurfactants were no longer available in the marketplace. And so the manufacturers had to switch to the C6 type products. And these, just about all of the manufacturers, except some in the far eastern region, have transitioned into the C6 fluorosurfactants. And these products do not contain or break down in the environment into PFOS or PFOA. They're considered much lower in toxicity and have significantly reduced bioaccumulative potential. So they bio-eliminate in a very quick time frame. So they're eliminated from your body. And depending on the type of fluorochemical that we're looking at, the C6 chemistry, it could be anywhere from several hours to several weeks, but they do not bioaccumulate in the body. And the foams made with only short chain C6 type fluorosurfactants do contain very, very small quantities of the PFOA as precursors or byproducts of the manufacturing process. As the suppliers of fluorochemicals get better and better and better, the amount of this PFOA and PFOA precursors is getting smaller and smaller and smaller. So it's not really something that we have to worry about at this point. So as we said, the foam manufacturers have already switched away from the old C8 chemistry to the C6 chemistry. If you purchased anything from about 2016 up through the present, it most likely contains only the C6 type fluorochemistry. So what does that mean to us? We're really kind of on the horns of a dilemma. Do we stay with the fluorinated foams, or do we switch to the SFFFs? And the question really becomes, will the C6 foams be regulated in the near future because of the PFAS awareness? So if you're in a particular state where they've already done some legislation that restricts the use, you need to take a real close look at that. The fluorine-free foams, or SFFFs, however, have not been proven to be as effective in large catastrophic fires. And the problem is we just don't have a lot of real history on using these fluorine-free foams on large catastrophic hydrocarbon fires. And the fluorine-free foams can have their own environmental issues. Certainly, most of them are much higher in aquatic toxicity than are their fluorinated cousins, if you will. Interesting to note, though, that the C6 foams do not fall under the EPA's drinking water advisory because they don't contain any PFOS or any PFOA in any significant quantities that would get you into that trigger of 70 parts per trillion. Let's take a quick closer look at fluorinated foams, and we'll kind of separate it into the pros and cons. And so on the pros side of this equation, we know that we have proven fire performance. The fluorinated foams, the AFFFs and AFFFs, have had a pretty good success rating in terms of being able to extinguish these large catastrophic fires. they can be applied at a lower critical rate than SFFFs. And by critical rate, I'm talking about the flow rate on any particular fire below which you wouldn't be able to put the fire out. In other words, the fire is consuming the foam at a faster rate than it's being applied to the surface. They're available in 1x3 concentrates, and there are some logistical advantages here that Bob certainly talked about earlier. And there's compatibility between like types of fluorinated foam. So if you have purchased an AFFF from manufacturer A and you want to take a look at switching over to manufacturer B, you can actually mix these two foam concentrates together in most cases. On the con side of it, though, we know that those environmental pressures of PFAS awareness are not really going away. And so there's the potential for groundwater contamination anytime you're applying foam and it lands on the ground rather than in the actual fire zone itself. And so, of course, there are some potential health risks associated with using fluorinated foams, especially the PFOS or the legacy C8 and higher homolog fluorotelmer products. The question has always come up as to whether or not the C6 products are as good as the older C8 products. However, since the military specification for AFFF now uses only C6 type products, and it's being held to the same fire performance characteristics as the old C8 type products, that's pretty much gone away as a topic of discussion. So let's take a closer look at why we would use fluorinated foams. Well, you know, fluorinated foams, as we discussed on the pro side of the equation, are available in 1x3 agents, and so there are logistical advantages here. You can imagine that if you had to have a mixed ratio of 3 parts of concentrate to 97 parts water, or 6 to 94, and you have to bring all of that foam concentrate to the fire scene, the lower that mix ratio, the more technical advantage you have in terms of how much foam you have to actually spot in the fire scene area. So being able to use a 1% concentrate rather than a 3% or a 6% concentrate becomes an advantage in the fire scene area. And fluorinated foams are less affected by what we would call low foam quality than are the fluorine-free foams. And so that means that you can use non-aspirating foam nozzles, which translates into a longer range and the ability to punch through the thermal updrafts of a large tank fire. Those thermal updrafts have been calculated to be, 50, 60, 70 miles an hour. So you can imagine that the more fluffy you make the foam, or the higher you expand it, the less chance you have of actually punching through that thermal updraft and getting foam onto the fuel surface. And if you can go with a sloppier type foam, the lower expansion ratio, then you have some advantages there as well, because these sloppy foams flow freely across the fuel surface, and they also provide more cooling at the immediate foam fuel interface and the interface between the foam and any hot metal surfaces. And we can use a fog pattern if we need to for firefighter exposure protection. There's a saying in the there's a saying in the marketplace: right for fight and left for life. And so all that's saying is if you have a variable pattern water fog nozzle and you turn it to the right, you get a straight stream pattern, and that gives you a lot of discharge range. If, however, there's some thermal event and you need to protect the firefighter that's at the nozzle, you can quickly move that nozzle to left, create a fog pattern which absorbs a lot of heat and allows the firefighter to move away from that. Well, let's take a closer look then at the synthetic fluorine-free foams, or the SFFFs. Again, we'll take a look at the pros and the cons. On the pro side, well, it's not PBT or PBMT as we talked about in the 3 strikes you're out rule, or the modified 3 strikes and you're out rule. However, some of the manufacturers do use some silicone surfactants, and it's questionable as to whether or not down the road those types of surfactants might come under the microscope as well, because again, they don't typically biodegrade as quickly as we might like them to. So they'd be around a little bit longer. There is proven effectiveness on some fire scenarios when using the SFFFs, and typically we recommend to anybody that if you have a spill type fire rather than a fuel in depth type fire, that the fluorine-free foams would definitely be a foam that's worth looking at and can be very, very effective. And there are no significant long-term health issues that we know of these products having at this point in time. On the con side of our equation here, they do not have proven effectiveness in large fuel in-depth fires. We talked about that a little bit earlier. And generally, they require a much higher critical application rate than do their fluorinated counterparts. So that means you need to bring a higher application rate to bear on any particular fire if using a fluorine-free foam versus its cousin, the fluorinated foam. They are much more sensitive to foam quality. As the foam expansion ratio drops much below 4 or 5 to 1 expansion, we find that the effectiveness of these foams gets lower and lower and lower. And because they're relatively new, like products from different manufacturers, are likely not compatible with each other. And finally, at least right now, they're not available in 1x3 type concentrates. So we lose that logistical advantage in large catastrophic fires. So what to do here? Well, we would suggest transitioning out of the C8 type products that we talked about a little bit earlier. And that's simply because there's going to be more and more and more environmental pressure to get rid of these products and not use them in the environment. So the C8 products should be removed from service and disposed of either by incineration or deep well injection. And another method that's come to light recently is to actually sorb those AFFF or AFFF concentrates on a solid material, then take that solid material to a hazardous waste landfill. But we could consider doing a dual approach for foam inventories, and that would be to position your fluorine-free foam, the SFFF, in areas where the hazard is going to be a spill fire, and then switch out those end-of-line discharge devices from the variable pattern water fog type nozzles to an air aspirated device, so we do get that better foam quality. And then we would consider installing maybe some state-of-the-art foam chambers so that we keep the foam in the fuel storage tank. And in that, by using these foam chambers, we can minimize the amount of submergence or the amount of contamination, because remember, these foams are not oleophobic. They will pick up fuel if they're submerged below the surface. And then consider using C6 fluorinated foams and keeping a stock on hand for large catastrophic fires, using what the industry has started calling big gun technology, but essentially, high flow monitors that are discharging 2,000, 3,000, 5,000 gallons per minute and using variable pattern water fog nozzles. So that's something to bear in mind as you're transitioning out of one type of foam concentrate to another. I like to say that the foam fire technology is kind of taking a step backward in time, unfortunately. And if we take a look at SFFF, I would tend to think of it as being kind of the 21st century version of regular protein foam. For those of you who have been involved in firefighting for a long time with firefighting foam, you may remember the regular protein foams, and you'd have to discharge them through an air aspirated type nozzle, and the foam came out very, very thick and viscous, almost the consistency of meringue on a lemon meringue pie, let's say. And the modern version, if we're going to say the 21st version, is certainly more mobile on the fuel surface than regular protein foam. It's not that thick meringue type consistency, but it is still prone to the fuel pickup. It doesn't have the oleophobic properties of the fluorinated foams. In fact, it's called oleophilic or oil loving. And I like to talk about it as the dog takes grease out of the way syndrome, right? You wash your dishes with dishwashing detergent because you want to emulsify the oils and greases that are on those plates. And so when we switch to the SFFF technology, we have to keep in mind that they are oleophilic, not oleophobic. And so we must minimize the amount of plunging on the fuel surface. So the question becomes, can I use that big gun technology? And that's what it's being looked at by the firefighting foam industry now. The Last Fire group, many of you are familiar with that group. and you may actually even be members of that group. The Last Fire group is taking a large look at how can we start employing these fluorine-free foams on these large catastrophic type fires that we might encounter. But in basis, we know that we have to have really good foam quality, and so that would be relatively high expansion rate. Again, you know, something in 5 or greater type category. And we want a very slow draining foam so that we can keep that foam blanket on the fuel surface for a long time. So we have to have that good foam quality, what we're calling better bubble structure or better bubble technology. But this higher expansion that we're talking about comes at the expense of range, right? There's only a certain amount of energy that's moving along that pipe or that hose line and reaching the end of line discharge device. And so if we don't have the ability to go back and forth between a straight stream that is only aspirated through the shear of the foam solution through the air, then we have the disadvantage of not having the ability to project it as far and not having the ability to switch to a fog pattern if there's a thermal event during the fire. And as I talked about earlier, the synthetic fluorine-free foams are more sensitive to fuel pickup than are the AFFFs. And we're actually finding in the industry that between different types of hydrocarbon fuels, we may need different application rates or different foam qualities. So if I'm doing a gasoline fire one time and now I've got a crude oil fire another time and now I've got a kerosene-based fire another time, we may find that the performance of any particular SFFF changes with the type of fuel that we're actually working on. And as I said earlier, generally speaking, the SFFFs require a higher application rate than their fluorinated cousins. And so there are logistical issues here that Bob talked about earlier. You may need more water supply. You may need more foam concentrate at the fire scene. And you may not have existing, at least right now, the ability to contain all of that. The dike quantities may have to get higher and higher and higher. And so we in the industry, as we develop products, we use performance fire testing as a way to look at different foam products. And really what it's for is so we can take a particular formulation and scale down the fire size to something much more manageable than a large fuel storage tank or a large dike area. We scale that down, and we hope that the performance fire test scales up then to a large scale event when we need it. Who does performance fire testing? Well, a lot of organizations or governments do it. Certainly Underwriters Laboratories, most people are familiar with, and Factory Mutual. European norms or the EN standards. Governments and militaries have their own standards for firefighting foam. ISO, International Standards Organization, ICAO, International Civil Aviation Organization, International Maritime Organization, and of course, Last Fire that I talked about a little bit earlier. They're all nothing more than scaled down versions of something that we might expect in the real world situation. Let's take a quick look though at a test that many of you may be familiar with or may heard about. Everybody kind of looks for that UL logo, right? I buy a drum or a tote or a pail of foam, and I'm looking to see whether or not it's UL listed, whether it has that UL logo on it. Interestingly enough, though, you can have a fluorinated foam with a UL listing, and you can have a fluorine-free foam that has a UL listing, and you would look at it and say, well, they must be identical because they both have passed that UL fire test. But that's not necessarily the case. Let's take a quick look at how they do differ. On the fluorinated firefighting foams and the fluorine-free firefighting foams, we start with a square pan that's 50 square feet in surface area, so roughly a little bit more than 7 foot by 7 foot. We put in 2 inches of water and then 2 inches or 62 gallons of heptane. In both fire scenarios, we give it a 60-second pre-burn before we start fighting the fire. But here we start to differ now between the fluorinated and the fluorine-free foam, or the film forming and the non-film forming type foam. If we have a film forming or fluorinated foam, the nozzle flow rate is 2 gallons per minute. If it's a non-film forming foam, fluorine-free foam, we up that flow rate to 3 gallons per minute. So there's the first thing that we change. The application rate then, if we simply take that 2 gallons per minute, divide it by the 50 square foot fire, the math works out that the application rate for a fluorinated foam is 0.04 gallons per minute per square foot of fire hazard area. And for the fluorine-free, it's 0.06 gallons per minute per square foot. So again, higher application rate. The application time that we're allowed to put the fire out in changes from 3 minutes on a fluorinated foam to 5 minutes on a fluorine-free foam. That turns out to give you an application density, or nothing more than application rate times the time, of 6 gallons per square foot of fire area for a fluorinated foam, and 15 gallons per square foot of fire area if it's a fluorine-free foam. So if we look at it, the fluorine-free foam, in order to get the same UL listing on that container, has a 50% higher application rate and a 250% higher application density, or total amount of foam solution that's applied to the surface. So you can see that we're not really comparing apples to apples, even though we're looking at that container and they both have that same UL logo on them. Let's think outside the box a little bit. What can we do here? Well, as we said earlier, you could certainly look at using fluorinated 1x3 type agents for large fuel and depth fires. You can have those stocks and those big guns sitting off and in a cache somewhere. Once we put the fire out, though, we should switch to a non-fluorinated, or SFFF, or a vapor suppressing product. As most of you know, more foam is actually consumed post-fire event than is actually consumed in putting the fire out. And so if we put the fire out with a fluorinated foam, let's take a look at suppressing any vapors post-extinguishment with a non-fluorinated version. And the other thing is to keep the fluorinated foam in the tank and not on the ground. And that would kind of eliminate the big gun technology, but we could certainly go to the foam chambers that we talked a little bit earlier, or we can take a look at a process called semi-subsurface injection, where the foam might be injected at the base of the tank, but it flows through a tube that goes up to the top of the tank. So those are some of the things that could be used if we want to minimize the amount of fluorinated foam that we would lose. So the main takeaways that I want to give to you folks is certainly the world is switching away from fluorinated foams. As I said, the train has left the station. It's only a matter of time before the fluorinated foams are going to be regulated to the point where you can't use them. But also keep in mind that the fluorine-free foams are not drop-in replacements. You're going to have to do some engineering that Bob talked about earlier. You need to take a look at, do I have enough water pumping capacity? Do I have enough total water? Do I have the ability to pump that higher volume of water at the pressure that's needed to operate an air aspirated discharge device? Certainly the application rate needs to go higher. Do I have the dike capacity to handle all of that material? So engineering considerations will need to be done when you switch from fluorinated to non-fluorinated foams. And keep in mind that all these fluorine-free foams are prone to more fuel pickup than their fluorinated counterparts. So we need to take a look at how can we apply that foam to a fuel surface so as to minimize that fuel pickup, that oleophobic nature of the foam. I can tell you that all of the foam manufacturers are continuing to improve their fluorine-free foam offerings. And so some of these problems that we've talked about are going to go away over time, but it's going to take a joint effort between the end user and the fluorine-free foam manufacturers. If I look at fluorine-free foams that were first introduced in the early 2000s to what we have on the marketplace today by a number of different manufacturers, certainly those products are better. So Keep all of these things in mind as you transition away from the fluorinated foams to the fluorine-free foams. Thank you, and at some point we can take questions and answer through the AFPM. We can certainly get questions that you may have forwarded on, and we can answer those questions. I thank you for your time, and I hope everybody works hard at changing over from the fluorinated foams to the fluorine-free type foams. Thank you very much.